The gates of a massive mansion swing open, and in a flash, a huge, snarling dog charges at a skinny boy in torn clothes. People scream as the beast clamps its jaws around his arm, but no one steps in to help. From a distance, the billionaire watches with a smug grin. "That's what happens when street rats trespass," he mutters. But then, something shocking happens. The boy, instead of crying out in pain, leans in and whispers something in the dog's ear. And just like that, the beast lets go. The crowd freezes. The billionaire's smug smile vanishes. Who is this kid? And why does his presence send chills down everyone's spine? Billionaire Harrison Grant wasn't just rich. He was a man who demanded power in every form. Owning businesses and lands wasn't enough. He wanted to control everything and everyone. In the corporate world, his name commanded fear. If a company refused to sell, it wouldn't be long before they faced mysterious lawsuits, sudden tax audits, or hostile takeovers. Competitors didn't just lose to him, they were erased. To those working under him, he was a tyrant in a tailored suit. Employees knew one wrong move could end their careers forever. Whispers of people being silenced, threatened, or ruined followed him everywhere. Yet, no one dared to speak out. And when it came to the poor, he had no mercy at all. He saw them as parasites, undeserving of kindness or opportunity. To him, they were just pawns in his game, easily ignored, easily crushed. But what Harrison didn't know was that one of those nobodies was about to change his life forever. Harrison Grant despised the poor. To him, they were nothing more than a burden on society, people who had failed to succeed and didn't deserve a second chance. He believed wealth was power, and those without it were worthless. He made sure to keep them far away. His massive estate, sitting on acres of prime land, was more than just a home. It was a fortress. Towering iron gates, high-tech security cameras, and armed guards patrolled the property day and night. No strangers were allowed near. No beggars dared to step foot close. Even those who lived nearby knew better than to cross his path. To Harrison, his mansion wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of his power, a reminder to the world that he was untouchable. But soon, someone would walk past those gates, someone he never expected, and that moment would change everything. In the shadow of Harrison Grant's grand estate, a small, ragged boy named Oliver stood, watching. His clothes were torn, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes held something far stronger than hunger. Other poor children looked at the mansion with fear or envy, but Oliver's gaze was different. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't about dreaming of a better life. It was something deeper: determination. Day after day, he stood there, staring at the towering gates, unshaken by the guards, unmoved by the warnings. It was as if he belonged there, as if he were waiting for the right moment. No one knew why he kept coming back. No one knew what he was searching for. But Oliver knew. And soon, so would everyone else. One day, Oliver stepped too close. He hadn't meant to. He knew the rules. No one trespassed on Harrison Grant's land and got away with it. But that day was different. Something precious had slipped through the iron bars of the gate, landing on the other side, just within the estate's yard. Oliver's heart pounded. He hesitated, glancing around. The guards weren't looking. The security cameras hummed quietly above. But maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't notice. Swallowing his fear, he took a step forward, then another. His fingers stretched out, just inches away from the object he couldn't leave behind. But before he could grab it, a low, menacing growl echoed from the shadows. Oliver froze. Something was watching him. Something dangerous. From the mansion's grand balcony, Harrison Grant spotted the boy. His sharp eyes narrowed as he watched Oliver, a ragged trespasser, daring to step onto his land. His lips curled into a cold smirk. He didn't need to shout or call his guards. He had a better lesson in mind. With a slight wave of his hand, he gave the order. "Titan, get him." The air tensed as a massive, snarling beast emerged from the shadows. Muscles rippled beneath its thick fur, its fangs bared, eyes locked onto Oliver like a predator about to strike. Harrison leaned back, expecting fear, panic, a desperate attempt to flee. But Oliver didn't run. And what happened next? No one could have predicted. Harrison Grant spotted the boy near his estate's yard, and his eyes burned with fury. How dare a filthy street kid step foot on his property? With a cruel smirk, he snapped his fingers. "Titan, attack!" From the shadows, a massive snarling beast lunged forward. Titan, Harrison's vicious guard dog, trained to obey only him. The crowd gasped as the dog charged, its teeth bared, eyes locked on its prey. Oliver had nowhere to run. The beast was almost upon him. But then, Oliver did something no one expected. Instead of screaming or running, he stood his ground. His lips moved, whispering something only the dog could hear. For a split second, Titan hesitated. Then, he stopped. The growling ceased. The tension in his body vanished. Instead of attacking, Titan just stared at the boy. The crowd fell silent. Harrison's smirk faded. His once loyal beast had defied him. Who was this boy? And what had he just done? Harrison's face twisted in rage. His prized attack dog, the one no one could tame but him, had just disobeyed in front of everyone. His hands clenched into fists as he stormed forward, his voice booming across the estate. "What did you do to my dog?" he bellowed, his eyes burning with fury. "Tell me, now." Oliver didn't flinch. He simply looked up at the billionaire, his expression calm, unreadable. The dog still stood beside him, quiet and still, as if waiting for a command, but not from Harrison. The crowd whispered in shock. The guards exchanged nervous glances. This had never happened before. Harrison took a step closer, his anger growing. No one controlled his dog. No one challenged his authority. And yet, this ragged street kid had done both. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Who are you?" A tense silence hung in the air. The crowd watched, barely breathing, as Harrison Grant stood face to face with the ragged boy who had just tamed his beast. But Oliver? He didn't look scared. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he simply smirked. With quiet confidence, he looked straight into Harrison's furious eyes and said, "Your dog recognizes me. Maybe you should too." A chill ran through the crowd. Harrison's expression shifted. For the first time in years, there was no arrogance in his eyes, just confusion and something else, something that looked a lot like fear. For a moment, Harrison just stared at the boy, his mind racing. The way Titan had obeyed him, the confidence in his voice. Who was this kid? Then, suddenly, Harrison threw his head back and laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the estate. "A street rat like you?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "Impossible." His cold, amused eyes scanned Oliver from head to toe, his torn clothes, dirt-smudged face, bare feet. There was no way this nobody could hold any power over him. "Maybe Titan took pity on you," Harrison sneered. "Or maybe you just got lucky." But deep inside, a seed of doubt had been planted. Because dogs don't bow to luck. And something about Oliver didn't feel like luck at all. Just as Harrison was about to dismiss the boy entirely, a sudden gasp cut through the tension. An old butler, standing among the staff, had gone pale. His hands trembled as he took a shaky step forward, his eyes locked on Oliver. Not with disdain, not with pity, but with something close to shock and recognition. "Sir," the butler's voice wavered. I think you should listen to him." The crowd stirred, eyes darting between the butler and the boy. Harrison's smirk faded. His gaze darkened. The butler had served him for decades. He had never questioned him, never intervened. But now? "What are you talking about?" Harrison snapped. The old man hesitated, then looked at Oliver again, his voice barely a whisper. "Because if it's really him, then he's not just some street kid." A heavy silence fell, and for the first time that day, Harrison felt a sliver of unease crawl down his spine. Just as Harrison was about to dismiss the boy entirely, a sharp gasp broke the silence. The old butler, a man who had served the Grant family for decades, stumbled forward, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. His wide, trembling eyes were locked on Oliver. "Sir," his voice wavered, thick with disbelief, "I think you should listen to him." Harrison's smug grin faltered. The butler had never interrupted him before, never questioned him. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Harrison snapped. "He's just a filthy street kid. He's no one." The butler swallowed hard, his hands shaking. He turned to Oliver, studying him closely. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he said something that sent a shockwave through the crowd. "No, sir. He isn't just some poor kid." His eyes flickered with something close to fear. "He's the rightful heir to a hidden fortune." The words hung heavy in the air. Harrison's face darkened, his breath caught in his throat. Because deep down, he knew exactly which fortune the butler was talking about, the one he had feared losing more than anything. And if this boy was who the butler claimed he was, then everything was about to change. A stunned silence fell over the estate. The butler's words echoed in Harrison's mind, each one heavier than the last. Rightful heir, hidden fortune. His pulse pounded as he glared at Oliver, but for the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes. The butler, still visibly shaken, turned to the crowd. His voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of a long-buried truth. "This boy, he isn't just anyone." He took a deep breath. His grandfather was Richard Kensington. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Even the guards, usually stone-faced, exchanged shocked glances. Harrison's expression hardened. Richard Kensington, a name that once struck fear and admiration in the world of business. A man of power, wealth, and influence, his fortune was said to rival even Harrison's. But he had vanished years ago, his empire torn apart after a brutal family betrayal. And in the chaos, his only grandson, Oliver, was lost, presumed dead. Yet here he was, alive, standing on Harrison Grant's property. And if this was true, then everything Harrison owned, everything he built, was at risk. Harrison's mind raced, his hands curling into fists. This had to be a lie, a trick. There was no way this filthy street kid was a Kensington. But then, Titan moved. The massive dog, once Harrison's unquestioning enforcer, slowly stepped forward, his eyes locked on Oliver. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the beast did something unthinkable. Titan lowered his head, in submission. Harrison's breath hitched. The butler's voice cut through the tension. "Now it makes sense," he murmured. Why Titan listened to him, why he stopped. He turned to Harrison, his gaze heavy, with a truth long buried. "Because Titan wasn't always your dog, sir." The words came out slow, deliberate. "He belonged to the Kensington family, before you took him." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Oliver's calm smirk deepened. He reached out, running a hand gently over Titan's fur, and the massive beast leaned into his touch like a long-lost friend. Harrison's chest tightened. He had stolen Titan years ago, back when the Kensington Empire collapsed. He had taken everything he could: power, wealth, and even the loyal pet of a family he thought was gone forever. But he was wrong, because now the rightful heir had returned. Harrison's smirk vanished. His breath came shallow and uneven. His mind spun, piecing together the truth he had refused to believe. If Oliver was alive, if he really was Richard Kensington's grandson, then everything was about to collapse. His businesses, his lands, his fortune, everything he had built, all of it was stolen from the Kensington family after their downfall. And with Oliver legally alive, the courts could tear it all away from him. His entire empire was at risk. The color drained from his face. For the first time in years, Harrison Grant felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: fear. The crowd murmured in shock, watching as the once untouchable billionaire stood frozen in place. Oliver, still stroking Titan's fur, watched him closely, his expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet, knowing voice, he spoke. "Now, do you recognize me?" Harrison's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the truth crushing down on him, but he refused to let it show. Number. He had worked too hard, clawed his way to the top, stolen and destroyed to own everything he had today. He wouldn't let some street rat take it all away. With a sharp breath, he snapped out of his shock. His hands trembled, but his voice came out cold and commanding. "Get this liar off my property, now!" The guards hesitated. Titan's defiance had shaken them, but at Harrison's furious glare, they rushed forward. At the same time, Harrison pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "I want my lawyers here, immediately." His voice was sharp, clipped with desperation. "And call the police. Tell them there's a trespasser causing a disturbance." He turned, barking at his security team. "I don't care what it takes. Make this go away." But something was different now. The crowd, once eager to obey his every word, now watched with uncertainty. The butler stood firm, and even some of the guards exchanged uneasy glances. Titan, still standing by Oliver's side, let out a low, warning growl. And Oliver? He simply crossed his arms and smirked, because he knew. Harrison was panicking, and when powerful men panic, they make mistakes. Harrison's shouts echoed across the estate, but the moment Oliver reached into his pocket, the noise faded into silence. With deliberate calm, Oliver pulled out a sealed envelope, its edges slightly worn, but the wax seal unbroken. He held it up for everyone to see. "You can call your lawyers, your security, even the police," Oliver said smoothly, unfazed by the chaos around him. "But none of them can change what's written in here." Harrison's eyes locked onto the letter, and for the first time, he looked truly afraid. The butler gasped. His eyes widened as he stepped closer, recognizing the distinct family crest on the seal. "That's..." His voice trailed off in disbelief. Oliver gave a knowing nod. "My grandfather left this behind, hidden away before his death. Legal proof of my inheritance." Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Harrison's breathing turned shallow. His mind raced for a way out, but deep down, he knew. This was real. If that letter contained what Oliver claimed, then his empire, his fortune, his entire stolen legacy was hanging by a thread. Just as Harrison's panic set in, the butler, once a silent observer, took a bold step forward. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with purpose. In them he held a stack of aged documents, along with a small recorder that looked worn from years of secrecy. The crowd turned to him, sensing that something even bigger was about to unfold. "Sir," the butler said, his voice steady, "for years, I have stayed silent. I have watched you take what was never yours. But today, the truth will finally come out." He held up the documents. "These are official records, hidden away by Mr. Kensington himself. Proof that his wealth was meant for Oliver." Then, he lifted the recorder. "And this? This is the final piece." Harrison's face turned ghostly pale. The butler pressed play. A static hum filled the air before a familiar voice, Richard Kensington's voice, echoed through the estate. "If something happens to me, if my grandson is ever found, this message must reach him. My fortune belongs to my bloodline. Harrison Grant is a thief. He betrayed me, stole what I built, and left my grandson to disappear. But if you're listening to this, Oliver, fight for what's yours." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Harrison's knees nearly buckled. He reached for his phone, for his security, for anything. But it was too late. The truth was out. And now, everyone knew. For the first time in his life, Harrison Grant wasn't in control. The air around him felt heavy, suffocating. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, rippling like a rising storm. His own staff hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The once loyal guards, men who would have carried out his orders without question, stood frozen, unsure whether to protect him or step aside. Even his high-powered lawyers, the ones who had always found a way to bend the law in his favor, backed away. They knew what this meant. The evidence was damning. The case was lost before it even began. Harrison's fingers twitched, his breath shallow. "No," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. This couldn't be happening. But Oliver simply watched him, calm and composed. The boy who was once dismissed as a worthless nobody now stood above him. And for the first time, Harrison felt small. Harrison barely had time to process what was happening before he heard the sound of tires screeching outside the gates. Then, flashes of cameras. A flood of reporters rushed in, microphones in hand, their voices clashing as they shouted over one another. "Is it true Oliver Kensington is alive? Mr. Grant, do you have a response to these allegations? Is your entire fortune built on a stolen inheritance?" Harrison staggered back, the world around him spinning out of control. The lawyers, those he once trusted to clean up his messes, stood stone-faced as they flipped through the documents. The lead attorney, a man who had defended Harrison for years, looked up gravely. "These documents are legitimate, Mr. Grant," he announced for everyone to hear. "There's no doubt. Oliver Kensington is the rightful heir." The crowd erupted. More reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, capturing every second of Harrison's downfall. His staff, the people who had once feared him, now looked at him differently, not with respect, but with disgust. And right in the center of it all, Oliver stood tall. The boy who had once been forgotten was now the name on every headline. Harrison's chest tightened as his phone buzzed violently in his hand. His fingers trembled as he swiped the screen, expecting a lifeline, a way out. Instead, he saw disaster. "Bank alert. Your accounts have been frozen due to an ongoing legal investigation." His heart dropped. Another message popped up. "Property seizure notice issued, effective immediately." Then another. "Urgent. Board of Directors emergency meeting. Your removal is under discussion." The world around him blurred. His fortune, his empire, his control, gone in an instant. He staggered back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He turned to his lawyers, expecting reassurance, a way to fight back. But they had already stepped away. His guards, no longer at his side, his staff, whispering, avoiding his gaze. The crowd, watching his downfall unfold like a public execution. Harrison gritted his teeth, trying to muster his usual arrogance, his legendary intimidation. But there was nothing left. His kingdom was collapsing, and standing in front of him, watching it all happen, was Oliver. Calm, steady, unshaken. The boy he had mocked, attacked, and underestimated. The boy he had once thought was beneath him, was now the one with all the power. As Harrison stood frozen in shock, Oliver took a slow step forward. The same boy who had once been chased away like a nobody now stood as the rightful owner of everything Harrison had stolen. The estate, the businesses, the fortune. All of it belonged to him now. The lawyers, the butler, and even the reporters turned their attention to Oliver, no longer a ragged outsider, but the true heir. A staff member hesitantly approached, holding out a set of keys, the keys to the mansion, to the empire. Oliver took them with steady hands, his face calm, but his eyes filled with a silent triumph. Harrison, still reeling, stumbled back. His voice was weak now, almost a whisper. This was mine. Oliver tilted his head, a small smirk playing on his lips. No, Harrison, he said, his voice steady and final. It never was. And with that, Oliver turned and walked past him, not as a trespasser, not as a poor boy begging for scraps, but as the rightful owner of it all. Harrison's legs felt weak as security, his own security, firmly grabbed his arms. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice cracking with desperation. "I built this empire. I own this place." But no one listened. The same guards who once enforced his every command now had no loyalty left for him. They escorted him down the grand steps of the estate, his estate, now belonging to someone else. The crowd parted as he was led through, whispers following him like ghosts. And then, a sharp, familiar sound cut through the air. A whistle. Harrison froze. His breath hitched as he turned back just in time to see Titan, the same vicious dog that had once attacked Oliver, now trotting obediently by his side. The massive beast that once belonged to him had chosen a new master. Oliver scratched behind Titan's ears, the dog leaning into his touch. Then, with a final glance at Harrison, he spoke the words that sealed it all. "Looks like even Titan knows who the real master is." Harrison's face burned with humiliation. With one last shove from security, the once powerful billionaire was forced out of the gates. The doors slammed shut behind him. And just like that, Harrison Grant was nothing. As the massive iron gates slowly closed, Oliver stood tall, watching the last traces of Harrison Grant fade into nothing. The very gates that had once shut him out, kept him away, marked him as an outsider, were now his. He ran his fingers over the cold steel, once a symbol of power, now a symbol of justice. The crowd was silent, watching in awe. The staff, the lawyers, even the reporters, all knew they were witnessing something historic. Oliver took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The boy who had been thrown away, forgotten, underestimated, had taken back everything. With a calm, knowing smile, he turned away from the gates and stepped inside, not as a beggar, not as an intruder, but as the rightful heir. And as the doors to the grand estate opened for him, Titan followed close by his side. The camera lingers on Oliver's silhouette against the mansion's golden glow. Fade to black.